Wow. Who is this Verna? It's so, I'm getting used to being me because for so long I was happily worked along in the shadows of some very amazing Indigenous women educators in Saskatchewan. So I want to thank the elders who offered prayers for us this morning. And thank you, Laurie, for that lovely introduction. And also thank you to the conference organizers for featuring our film yesterday. And also I just wanted to acknowledge that I have felt and been treated very well in coming to this conference, and I feel very respected. So I want to thank Brent and Diane and Laurie. So, okay, I have to remember that I do have a PowerPoint. Sometimes I forget about that. And I tried not to make too many slides because this past couple of years I worked with a real expert facilitator who encouraged me to use less slides. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that Laurie reviewed. I retired from the faculty position at the University of Saskatchewan in December after 30 years. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm still adjusting to being a senior citizen. I really am. I started on this journey of trying to change public education to be more equitable for Indigenous children when I was just 20 years old and newly enrolled in the Indian Teacher Education Program, which, by the way, has begun celebrating its 50 years anniversary, so 1973 to 2023. And on Friday, I have the honor of being on a panel along with Saul Sanderson, who was former FSIN chief and also a huge advocate of the establishment of the Indian Teacher Education Program at the University of Saskatchewan in the late 60s and early 70s. So today, I want to share with you some of what I've learned along the way about the challenges we face and why I think anti-racist education could be helpful in finding our way towards more equitable and just returns from our investments in public education. Now, on one hand, public education serves as a unifying institution. Our experiences of public education is what we all share in common as citizens of this country: judges, lawyers, physicians, politicians, people in the trades, officials at all levels of government, police service, healthcare workers, have all been socialized through the knowledge curriculum, extracurricular school activities, beliefs and values of all school staff, curriculum, and values, beliefs and values embedded in curriculum resources. In other words, as presented in our film yesterday, public education is not neutral and objective as we are so often led to believe. And Indigenous people and people designated as undesirable at different moments in our history know all too well. And it is on these grounds, this context, that Indian education as we know it in public education has developed and oftentimes struggled. So although there has been many scholars who've written about and brought attention to the not so innocent and perhaps we could say the hidden curriculum of schools, I think John Walensky in his 1998 book, Learning to Divide the World, Education at Empire's End, says it most directly. He argues that schools, quote, schools have not been so much the great redeemer of prejudices as the tireless chronicler of what divides us, tells us who belongs and who is and is not a member of Canada. And he further argues that schools taught us to discriminate in the most innocent and fateful ways so we can appreciate the difference between the civilized and the primitive. He taught us how to divide the world. Wilinski comes short of arguing that schools taught us to be racist. So we are now left with some kicking and screaming when faced with the demands to take the responsibility to challenge the anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous racism and white supremacy that is on the increase across North America, both in the United States and in Canada. Teaching and figuring out how to teach anti-racist education and teacher education has occupied most of my career. In many respects, it has been a lonely journey. Those of us who practice anti-racist education encounter so many sources of silencing, the fear of the discomfort, erasure over what's considered to be more pressing concerns, like claiming that poverty and social inequality is the real issue, not racism. The environment is a more worthy cause, claims that it is too negative, protestations that Canada is a peace-loving, multicultural country, and there couldn't possibly be any racism here. That happens in other places and other times. So to become an anti-racist educator in this context has required personal and professional conviction that racism is a social problem that will not go away by ignoring it. My lifelong focus on challenging anti-racist education is grounded in my experiences of my family and community, living and surviving in a very much 1950s, 1960s social colonial pioneer climate that relegated us to the margins and beyond. And as late Métis scholar Howard Adams, in his book titled Prisons of Grass, Native Life in Canada, that book had a profound impact on me, and his thinking and writing continues to inform my work today. That's the power of Indigenous, Métis, First Nations, Inuit scholars. We were assigned that book in my first semester in the Indian Teacher Education program back in the fall of 1978. That's like 45 years ago. And he wrote so compellingly about the power of white supremacy and racism that had been and was being so effective in distorting our Indigenous humanity, dehumanizing us through public education, teacher attitudes, and beliefs. School curriculum that ridiculed our people both in texts and in illustrations of school resources and histories. He challenged the dehumanizing portrayal of our people. He said things like, many racist images are so distorted that they portray natives as little more than savages without intelligence or beauty. He argued that schools systematically and meticulously condition natives to a state of inferiorization and colonization. I was 20 years old when I read those kinds of words. And it spoke to my the experience that I had. You know, I made it through the K-12 system. I made it through in spite of the system. I made it through because I had a love of learning. So I began my public education in 1964. These were the early years of integrating First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people into public education, town schools. Kids from the neighboring First Nations were bused into town. Some of us were non-status and Indian Métis coming from around, scattered here and there. I was one of those, me and my seven siblings. So over 20 years, as part of my doctoral research, it didn't take me 20 years, but you know, I traced the history of the development of the field of educational anthropology. I had some amazing professors, both from my master's degree and my PhD degree. And they taught me how to be a respectful supervisor, because I always felt honored by them. So I was interested in understanding concepts like culture. And so I did a history of the development of the field of educational anthropology and a history of the field of anthropology as a discipline. And its enormous impact on the development of Indian education through its main theoretical concepts like culture, cultural discontinuity, cultural disadvantage, cultural dissonance, later cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness. It's a much bigger story than I can tell here. But what educational anthropology did with its culture concept, and all those well-meaning people who use culture as the main explanatory framework to understand and explain why Indigenous kids and other kids who had been racialized as inferior, why we were not succeeding in public education, changed over time. But we were variously, and have been variously, described as suffering or failing due to cultural dissonance, because of cultural discontinuity between home and school that results in our being disadvantaged. And so two concerns with relying exclusively on the cultural discourse, cultural explanation framework is that it left out the impact of poverty, left out the impact of racist exclusion for all but the most menial, seasonal, very low-paying, exploitative forms of employment for our people. And so the question that framed my doctoral research was, how did a race and class analysis get left out of explaining why Indigenous children were not succeeding in schools in the 1960s? And I would say to some degree in the present. How did that characterization of schools failing Indigenous children get attributed to Indigenous children having too much culture, then later shifting from the early 1970s to not having enough, to these days since the TRC to be too traumatized to learn? How are these narratives of Indigenous deficiency kept alive and serve to deny Indigenous children the right to education? And so I know that yes, we have been traumatized, and yes, teaching from a trauma-informed perspective is important, but also we need to be careful that it doesn't shift into like another deficiency discourse. I'm getting ahead of myself, so I need to return to the close of the 1960s, a very powerful time for Indigenous resurgence and Indigenous political mobilization. The White Paper, the Red Paper, the Hawthorne Report of 1966 and 1967, recognizing the special status of Indian people. So in my talk, I'm going to use the terms Indian, Native, depending on the documents I'm referring to. So in 1964, some of you might be aware that the Minister of Department of Citizenship and Immigration asked that a study be undertaken of the contemporary situation of Indians in Canada with a view to understanding the difficulties we faced and how will we overcome these pressing problems and their many ramifications. So I think it's important always to understand and see our history and how it shapes the present. And that's what Indian control of Indian education called for 50 years ago. So in chapter 2 of my dissertation, I do an analysis of the chapters in volume 2 of the Hawthorne Report released in 1967, the year that I was in grade 3, when school programming included taking part in celebrating Canada's 100th birthday. I remember that clearly. And so, I remember reading those 2 chapters in that volume, and they're widely available on the internet. I highly recommend that you look them up, because they're very informative in terms of what the past that that to some degree we've inherited. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint now. There we go. So the Hawthorne Report, and I'm not going to go, he was a good guy. He had done research in British Columbia. He cared about Indigenous people. So those two sections, there was 2 chapters in that report. The goal was to examine the failure of schools to meet the varying needs of children from different socioeconomic and ethnic groups. And so those were the conditions in 1967. Low academic achievement, high grade discrepancy, high absenteeism. So when I first began reading, I was hopeful because the report said that it would focus on the failure of schools and not the failure of children. In other words, is it the school failing children or is it children who are failures? I have a point of contention with how we identify educational problems, because how we define the problem, who and what the problem is, shapes and influences who and what we think needs to change. And I have noticed far too often with educational researchers, and especially grad students, who arrive with a research problem and have embedded in their research problem statement or research question assumptions about Indigenous this or Indigenous that, without serious consideration of the broader historical context of our researchable problems, or else embedded in such questions is the assumption of innocence on the part of those who work with our children. So what we define as the problem impacts the solutions we pursue. In other words, who and what needs to change. And so the Hawthorne Report claims that the goal of research is to improve the living conditions of Indians on reserves and to prepare Indian people to, quote, hold a job, to live fully and make a valuable contribution to society, to help Indian children develop a better awareness of his responsibilities as a citizen, to help them improve their standard of living, to help Indians make something of themselves. With so much goodwill, how could the situation not improve? And yet we see such disparities in the quality of living for Indigenous people in this country against all others. And again, in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People reports that despite so many sincere efforts to change the quality of education, now this is 25 years ago, little has changed. This was around the time that I was researching for my doctoral research, reading the Hawthorne Report. And they, observed that the same concerns that Aboriginal people have been bringing forward since the first studies were done. So in the 1960s, then, the culture concept was used to explain low academic achievement of Indian kids, and scholars, researchers, educators argued that school failure was due to a clash of cultural values, that Indian people devalued education, and that this devaluation of education was attributed to their psychological and cultural difference. And so I challenge you to think about how culture is still relied on to explain school failure. It certainly has changed and become more sophisticated, more nuanced under the guise of doing good. So for example, in the 1960s, it was commonplace to describe Indian communities, Indian parents through deficiency discourses. Some Indian communities tend to devalue formal education. So you can imagine, I started reading this report with a lot of hope, right? And then the report was littered. And the interesting thing was they were researching the early years of experiences of Indigenous people in public education. They actually interviewed Indigenous parents. And it was a qualitative study, if you're not familiar with it. And I could just do this whole presentation just on the Hawthorne Report, but we're not going to. And I remember a few years ago presenting to all the senior Ministry of Education in Saskatchewan. and I just did the Hawthorne report. I thought, okay, these people need to know their history. And that was the response. Like, they were just surprised, like what they said was so little has changed. And this is, let's just say 10 years ago, about. So that kind of, I just want you to be familiar with those deficiency discourse, those deficiency narratives, those deficiency stories that I wanted to fight back against those. And so, you know, just describing our people at that time as lacking motivation, as lacking interest, as lacking commitment. So lack in their ability, belief in their ability. Today we refer to these beliefs, these sort of statements as deficiency narratives. Deficiency discourse, deficiency thinking. Critical race researchers have noted that this kind of thinking is practiced widely towards students racialized as brown and black, as less than, as inferior, as incapable. Now, we must remember that all these are interpretations. These statements are made by people, human beings, apparently objectively assessing, interpreting, and explaining why Indian kids were not succeeding in that environment that I cited Howard Adams observing about schools in his book, Prisons of Grass, that Indian kids were required to attend schools that portrayed natives as little more than savages without intelligence or beauty. Of course, some positive changes have happened, but how to successfully teach Indigenous children sometimes, to me, seems to remain a mystery. Interestingly, almost 6 decades ago, embedded into this Hawthorne report is another observation that directs our attention to other explanations, although the report doesn't dwell on this too much. So, for example, the Hawthorne and his colleagues, actually Joan Ryan, who was a professor at the University of Calgary for some time, she wrote one of the original books on urban Indians back in the late 70s, early 80s, Joan Ryan. She was one of the researchers for this study. This is someone who cared about Indigenous people. They observe that in general, teachers do not expect Indian students to perform well in school at any level. There's little enthusiasm about educating these children because they are accepted unquestionably as ineducable. So instead of focusing on changing and fixing children, what would it mean and what does it take to shift the perspective of school personnel? And I think that's why we're here today. Again, after all these years of sincerely looking for answers as others have, I came to rely on the work of others, and one that I draw on specifically for the purposes of today is Dr. Carrie Ilucci, an American white anti-racist educator, teacher educator and research, who, when all is said and done, concluded in the 21st century that, quote, meaningful change is most often hampered by teacher and administrator perceptions and beliefs. She acknowledges that it's not easy, quote, not easy to change perceptions, and that challenging commonplace teacher-administrator beliefs about student worthiness, aptitude, merit, and effort coalesce to authorize underachievement. And then, she says, also tend to create the most resistance. So, back to the issue I raised at the onset of my talk. Problem identification defines who and where change needs to happen. If we are to achieve more equitable educational outcomes, and despite 6 decades of various kinds of intervention, deficit discourse about Indigenous children abound in our systems, whether as in the past, as I mentioned earlier, too much culture, that children had to be civilized, then later shifting to not enough, to these days, since TRC, to being traumatized, too traumatized. It is true, and plenty of evidence that we have experienced a collective traumatization, and that, as I mentioned earlier, trauma-informed teaching has merit and lots to offer. I also worry that we are characterized as too traumatized to learn. And I worry that this becomes another way for narratives of Indigenous deficiency are kept alive and serve to deny Indigenous children the right to education. And so in the early spring of 2010, the Canadian Teachers Federation released a research report that I had conducted. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a study of the professional knowledge and experience of Aboriginal teachers in public schools. With the assistance of all the provincial and territorial teacher organizations and unions, I interviewed and I ran focus groups across the country over a 3 or 4 month period. And so there is a total of 60 teachers that participated, Indigenous teachers in public schools that participated in this study. And among many findings, and I'll share more of that towards the conclusion of my talk, Aboriginal teachers noted that they witnessed too often low expectations of Indigenous kids, expecting less of Aboriginal kids, being guided and encouraged out of mainstream, characterizing students as lazy, unmotivated, and indifferent. It's 10 years ago. Or maybe you could say 15 years ago, collecting the data. So deficit discourse and low expectations ensure that ongoing achievement gap that we often talk about. And so I teach about this as a system of institutionalized racism that works in a way, you have the discourse of they don't care, they're uneducable, that then justifies the practice of low expectations, that then guarantees the achievement gap, and then that low achievement gap then perpetuates, so it works in a circle. And round we go. And I know that we're all here trying to disrupt that, and my way of trying to disrupt that is to bring a critical race analysis. And so how do we ensure that Indigenous children are not denied a high-quality education under the guise of meeting students where they are at and lowering expectations? How do we ensure that students are not merely experiencing social promotion? How do we not inflate graduation rates by inflating success by lowering the bar, so that eventually our children, if they don't have the basics, will hit a brick wall of exclusion? So I'm just going to tell, I take a break, take a break from me. I forget where I was preparing a talk, maybe in the College of Education about a month ago. And I'm a sentimental person, so I keep a lot of mementos, including papers I wrote in high school and in university. And I was going, my dad gave me a suitcase when I graduated from high school. He's like, here's your suitcase, move along. And I still have that suitcase. But I fill it with memories. And so one day I was looking through there and I found a paper that I wrote in grade 8 on Mussolini, on the rise of fascism in Italy prior to the Second World War. And I was like, how timely, in the 21st century. So the other day I was making notes from my paper that I wrote when I was 13 years old. And here I was living with my dad, We were living on the edge of town in a shack with no running water, outdoor toilet. He worked on the reserve. He left early in the morning. I was left to get the rest of the kids to school. And I was 13 years old, and he was a single parent. And I don't think there was much expectation on the school from our family. And yet there I was, just so eager to learn. And I was just telling David, or maybe Brent this morning, that a few weeks ago I had lunch with my high school teacher. So I maintain good relations, just so you know. And she said to me, after I graduated in 1976, I wish I would have done more to help you. I'm sorry. So, yes, culturally responsive and land-based education is so very important, as we featured in our film yesterday. And I have also learned over the years that we also need anti-racist education, and the two are not the same. And just so you know why I'm talking about this, we have Colton Boushie and the RCMP finally admitting, 2 years ago, that yes, Colton's mother experienced racism on the part of the RCMP. And then in the fall of 2021, yes, the report that was done on the death of Joyce Echaquan, an acknowledgement that yes, she had experienced racism and that she may be still alive if she wasn't Indigenous. So these are the stories that unfold every day. So some of you might be aware that on April 1st, a young Indigenous man was beaten now to death by 5 to 7 police officers in the city of Prince Albert. And so, every other day or every other year or every other month, when these kinds of situations of brutal violence against our people, it just propels me to say, cultural awareness education might help in these situations, but more importantly, we need to understand how racism is mobilized to give less worth to the lives of Indigenous people and others who've been racialized as less than. We need a collective understanding of why race matters. What is racism? What's the history of race thinking? How did racial theories evolve? What purpose did they serve historically and in the present? There's a large body of research that has evolved over the last 5 decades and has rapidly advanced in the past 2 decades as we witness growing racial disparity across North America. How race matters and what is racism appears more and more on the public radar, and a review of public comments on any story involving racism demonstrates the need for our public to be far more informed and educated than is presently the case. When I began my studies of anti-racist education, I found the following definition very helpful. And these are Canadian scholars, and of course they're drawing on scholars, the previous decade or so. But race matters because it regulates our interpretation of who we trust, who we identify with, who we intrinsically see as intelligent, athletic, weak, lazy, smart, trustworthy. So in a racist society, skin color has become a marker for reading the worthiness of people. It's what racial profiling makes, it's what makes racial profiling possible. Imagine, skin color is used as a way to read and interpret and assess human qualities and characteristics and capacities of human beings, where darkness is read for disadvantage, bad, wrong, and whiteness for advantage, good, and innocence. And our kids are picking it up today, and we're not teaching them about it. We ignore it. We pretend it's not in the room. It's what do they say, the elephant in the room? No one wants to talk about it. We need the language. And I think public education and teacher education need to do more. So it's a desire to disrupt this thinking that leads to such devastating results that has motivated my research and my teaching all these years. 3 years ago, in my role as special advisor to the president of the University of Saskatchewan, I'm the special advisor on anti-racism and anti-oppression to the president of the University of Saskatchewan. Imagine that. I'm still amazed. And so part of what we do, I have a team, and we've been providing anti-racist education for all senior university leaders, all the deans. You know, and the president made that commitment in 2020 after the brutal killing of George Floyd. Finally. And so as part of that role, in that advisory role that I have, which I did retire from my faculty position, and then I got rehired a month later as a special advisor, part-time, 0.6. Oh, yes. Anyway, so what we did was we did a scan of Canadian universities looking for what they offered in terms of anti-racist education. Very scanty offerings. In colleges and faculties of education, even less of the vast body of literature is either taught in undergraduate or even less at the graduate level. We need that knowledge. We need to develop anti-racist scholars, researchers, teachers, educators. We need to raise the bar and the standards and requirements for aspiring school leaders. And the ability to offer extended, ongoing professional development for in-service teachers and leaders. At the University of Saskatchewan, I've taught a required anti-racist, anti-oppressive education course to student teachers and candidates. When I first started in my faculty position 30 years ago, I was tasked with that responsibility. And I was like, oh my goodness, yes, I will do this. You know, it was likely the first required course in this country. It was an important task. And since the body of research on how to best do that in undergraduate education has exploded, actually, and in the first decades, much of that literature was concerned with how to understand and then respond to student fear, discomfort, anger, resistance to unlearning racism. I have been in the fire my whole career. Can you imagine? To walking in semester after semester, year after year. They've taught me a lot. And through their fear and their discomfort, they taught me how to teach them. And that they were teachable, right? They were educable. And then later I developed an elective course for graduate students. Teachers who came into graduate school, like practicing teachers, and they came in with 5, 10, 15 years of teaching experience, and they were looking for answers for what they were seeing and what they were being asked to be a part of in schools. And unfortunately, because I taught in a Department of Educational Foundations, I had few students from educational administration that came to take such a course. The odd student would enroll, sometimes out of desperation, looking for a course at the last minute. Mine was available. I mean, they tell me that right out. I'm not saying anything about them. They said that to me. I encountered over those years even less students from ed psych and curriculum development, grad students, professionals. You know, about 3 or 4 years ago, just before retiring, like last December, or just like 4 months ago, I was approached by a PhD student from another university wanting to do research in my anti-racist, anti-oppressive undergraduate course. Never met the person before, but she approached me at a big conference. And I asked her, are you familiar with that large body of research on white pre-service teachers and anti-racist education courses? No. I said, well, why would you want to do research on such a course then? Especially with an Indigenous member doing such teaching. And I said, oh, we face more student resistance and anxiety. So I said, you go read that literature. And come back to me if you're still interested afterwards. And she did. And they shared with me that now they understood why it was important to read that literature. So, we went ahead. I allowed her into my class to do research. But graduate students in admin, ed psych, curriculum need access to graduate anti-racist education, and yet few educational programs provide that opportunity, never mind require it. So I was given, a platform to talk to the College of Education in my home college, retired, and the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research made a public commitment like here that they would work on that requirement. And the provost was in the audience as well, and she said, well, there you go. You can ask in a year or 2 years or 3 years, did she fulfill that commitment? So we'll see. So in my case, with those many grad students that I did meet over the years, some of whom began to organize within the Saskatoon Public School Board to establish a committee of school leaders, consultants, teacher educators, teachers committed to social justice, and I began working with this committee on a regular and ongoing basis 7 years ago. And I recently turned that role of leading the Saskatoon Public Education School Division to my colleague and my former student, Dr. Carmen Gillies, and she's now a member of the College of Education. So although I began working with Saskatoon Public Schools in the spring of 2017, I had always supported individual teachers or principals however I could. But to actually work with an established group of committed people in an ongoing, regular way began then. At first, they called themselves the Social Justice Disposition Committee and have since revised the name of the group to the Anti-Racist, Anti-Oppressive Education Committee. I provided, in collaboration, with a team consisting of a superintendent who was assigned to support that group, 3 staff members, and what we did is over these last 7 years, offer a series of 5 2.5 to 3 hours of professional development per year on anti-racism. And we explored many issues and topics with assigned readings for each session. So I'll just give you a break and tell you a story again. Because I have like 10 minutes left and I think I'm on time. Anyway, so 2 superintendents. I have very good relations with Saskatoon Public. I'm a big fan. And Dwayne, you look familiar. I thought you looked familiar. Great, I'm glad you're here. Thank you. So I would meet with these 2 superintendents. One was Indigenous, that I had mentored a few years prior. And they would meet with me and they'd say, anti-racist education, yes, we would like to do anti-racist education. And I'm like, yep, I'm right there with you. And then 6 months later, we write about this. Let's have coffee and tea again and anti-racist education. Let's do it. I said, okay, yeah, we will. I don't know what I was thinking, I thought they were going to tell me what to do. And then the 3rd time, yeah, we'd really like to get it going. And then I thought, oh, they want me to do it. I was like, yeah. And so I said to them, well, will your people read? And they're like, yes, our people will read. And so I said, okay, I'll send you a couple articles. And we read White Teachers and Race, a couple of articles. And we had several superintendents and principals. And I was actually very humbled by their response to those readings and what I felt was authentic engagement and meaningful. And so they wanted more, and that's how we started. More, more, more. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that work. So we talked about we read, and I gave lectures, and I assigned readings, white teachers and race, schools as racialized spaces, the problem with meritocracy and colorblind ideologies, history and consequences of racial theories, how race impacts Indigenous students and teachers, becoming an ally, the property value of whiteness, protecting education as white property, identity production in culturally responsive and anti-racist education, critical race autobiography, and so on and so on. And worked over those years with a committed core of about 20 to 25 school leaders, superintendents, principals, vice principals, consultants, and teachers. So funded by the McDowell Foundation under the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, I'm wrapping up a study titled How School Leaders Narrate Their Personal and Professional Experience with Anti-Racist Education. I have presented a brief synopsis of the findings to both the Anti-Racism Committee and again in January to all high school and junior high school, elementary school principals, all the superintendents, and other senior leaders. And I think I can safely say that I remain a friend and advocate of the Saskatoon Public School Board's efforts to become a school division committed to anti-racist education. And it's informed by the growing body of research by research of researchers on school leaders and anti-racist education. There's actually now in the last 10 to 15 years literature on this issue. I used to look for it 20 years ago and it didn't exist. Literature that's affirming that racism is held in place or deterred by those who retreat from or avoid the discomfort of anti-racist learning. And so there are 12 participants in my study, and what I learned over these past years of their involvement and commitment to developing a race consciousness, they had this to say, that in their process of developing a race consciousness, they're like, you start to sweat a little, And this one says, I'm going to just read from down here because I don't think I wrote. You get uncomfortable, you realize that is what I'm doing, and that's when you start to sweat a little. Once the seed is planted, you can't go back without feeling cringy. The biggest thing is realizing you made a lot of assumptions and you need to change. If I'm being totally honest, I had part of that white savior part in me. Because we also learn about like the white hero and white saviorism. And I thought I was an ally before I was one. I thought I understood way more than I did. This is humility, an example. And so I believe that Indigenous, and so this is also Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators need anti-racist education. Being Indigenous doesn't necessarily mean one is knowledgeable about anti-racist education. We may experience racism on a regular basis, but we also need the education. It's not innate. It takes time, commitment, and lots of courage. the participants in this study, this is a little study like a pilot study, and hopefully it becomes a bigger study. They acknowledge the importance of taking risks and engaging with difficult knowledge, because as they reported, they know, oh geez, I'm a little mixed up here. Anyway, so members of the Anti-Racist Education School Committee, which included both non-Indigenous and Indigenous members, commented on the power of anti-racist, developing their anti-racist literacy and how this impacts schools. For example, it gives it a voice, it gives it a word. We have words for these experiences. And that's what I also hear at the university level. They don't have the literacy, they don't have the language, and they need it. There have been times when I've been able to articulate what I was feeling, so I wasn't able to articulate what I was feeling, so I just walked away. So in terms of giving me the vocabulary to address things and recognize the systemic issues that we have, that's powerful, to have the language, to name what you're experiencing. And it equipped me as a school leader to feel comfortable about having conversations with people. And so this report will be available in the fall of 2023, and I hope that school divisions beyond Saskatchewan will find it useful for their own professional development. I have two more areas I briefly wish to share with you by way of concluding. 2 years ago, the Saskatoon Public School Board actually hired an anti-racist educational consultant, a staff member already within their system, someone I had mentored through their master's in their anti-racist, anti-oppressive education over a decade ago. And she also has about 20 years teaching experience or experience in the system. Although she does need a team, and hopefully someday this might be a reality, nonetheless, she managed at the end of her first year to guide the school board through an approval of a much revised administrative policy that is informed by and demonstrate a strong commitment to anti-racist education. And I'm just going to share these slides with you. So the Saskatoon strategic plan now has a commitment, fulfill our commitment through relationships, equity, and accountability, and that an understanding that equity is enacted through anti-racist, anti-oppressive practices. And then they also have a leadership for learning framework, and on equity, anti-racist, anti-oppressive competencies that include enacting leadership actions in pursuit of equity, reconciliation, social justice, critiquing their own cultural identities and assumptions as they engage in and lead professional learning, help create conditions for collaboration, innovation, and risk-taking, especially in their efforts to decolonize their educational practice, and then their administrative policy that, that there will be no more denial, that there's an acknowledgement, awareness, and understanding of bias, that our systemic and individual bias, racism, and oppression exist within our school division. I just about fell over when I read that. Right? Whoa, that's such a change. And may be perpetuated unless explicit, persistent, determined action is taken to identify, challenge, and overcome them. It's publicly available if you go to their website, their administrative policy. So they also have a manual to help their administrators, which I guess is not public. I just talking to Cheryl, who developed the, shepherded the policy through. So, so that's a change that I'm proud to be a part of and to support and help them and support them in their ongoing work. And so finally, I do want to conclude with, go back to the study of Aboriginal teachers in public schools. And I mustn't have saved my edits that I made on this talk. But anyway, so I'll ad-lib. So all the years of my undergraduate teaching, eventually the students, by 11th week, 10th week, 12th week, there'd be eyes opening and kind of a coming around and understanding. And then they would start asking questions like, okay, how will we not be the problem? How will we be allies? How can we be supportive? What do we need to do? So then when I had this opportunity to research and interview Indigenous teachers, I thought, well, I'll just ask them, what are the qualities and characteristics of effective allies of Indigenous education? What do they do? And so if you want to read it more fully, you can read it in the report, but I'm just going to give you I think I've got 4 slides. So they're not always in full view, the strong supporters. I can think of a principal who helped with the Aboriginal program. He was not in full view, but he was always behind, making sure everything was in place. You did not have to run and get this or that. If you were looking for something, he would be there and he would have it. He just made sure that whatever you were doing for your program went smoothly. He was like the little gopher. I was like, okay, we got that. Not in full view. And then also, what I heard also was they want your program to go smoothly. They want success. The other was to reject paternalism. We don't want someone to come in and save us and make everything all better. Aboriginal people, we want to be involved in the decision making. We don't want people to fix it for us. And then another, and this, I always remember this particular teacher who was on the eve of retiring after 30 years. He finally came to a realization and explained and apologized to us. I have to apologize. Never once did I think to consult any of you. You have taught me so much. This man was big enough to be willing to say he hadn't been right. So the ability to admit wrongdoing. And, another participant said, I didn't get the message through very clearly unless it was done by a non-Aboriginal person because they were willing to listen to the non-Aboriginal person first. This happens a lot. When I was teaching a few years ago, I was teaching a grad class and I had a retired RCMP officer retraining to be an adult educator. And he put up his hand and said, I've witnessed that very often, in the RCMP community. He'd say if an Indigenous woman RCMP would be offering a good idea and completely ignored, and then he said, I'll put her up my hand and I say the same thing and suddenly I'm the hero. So that was helpful to hear, and it's a story I get to tell, right, to validate that piece of research. And then finally, they said, allies who are open and flexible, those colleagues, the people that are sitting beside us at the table who are Aboriginal, they are helpful if they can come to the table open and flexible in their thinking and not have an agenda. So this is some of the wise advice of Indigenous professionals in our public schools who have worked tirelessly over the past 50 years to make a difference in the lives of our children. And I hope that my research program has assisted in that endeavor and will continue to assist and support the needed change all our children deserve and that our society so desperately needs. Thank you for your attention.